Ah, look at what just walked back into the room. You, the one they scripted out of the story. The one they quietly, carefully, surgically removed from every plan, every conversation, every table where decisions were being made. You. The one they whispered about in hallways with their mouths barely moving, their eyes scanning the room to make sure you weren't close enough to hear. You. The one they built an entire architecture of silence around, because as long as you stayed quiet, as long as you stayed confused, as long as you stayed in the dark, they were safe. And then you opened your mouth. One sentence. And everything they spent months constructing crumbled in under 60 seconds. Before we go any further, this script is drawn from the Joker Doctrine, the art of the last laugh. A doctrine built not for the fragile, not for the ones who fold under pressure, but for those who have been underestimated so many times that the underestimation itself became their greatest weapon. The Joker Doctrine is not about chaos for chaos's sake. It is about the precise, calculated art of holding your power until the moment it matters most, and then, without warning, without announcement, without mercy, laughing last. Let that sink in for just a moment. Not a lawsuit, not an expose, not a revenge campaign, or a public breakdown, or a dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. One sentence. That's all it took. Because here is what the architects of your destruction never calculated into their perfectly engineered plan. They studied your weaknesses obsessively. They mapped your silences like cartographers. They memorized your flinches like scholars. But they never, not once, studied your clarity. They forgot that a person who has been silent long enough doesn't just speak, they detonate. Understand what they built before we talk about what fell. Their strategy wasn't improvised. It wasn't careless. It wasn't the work of amateur saboteurs acting on impulse and ego alone. No. What they constructed against you was deliberate, layered, patient, and almost beautiful in its cruelty. They spent real time on this. They had meetings, silent agreements, carefully worded messages that left just enough ambiguity to be deniable. They had allies, people who smiled at you warmly while passing information behind your back like folded notes under a classroom desk. They controlled the narrative before you even knew there was a narrative to control. They framed you before you had a chance to introduce yourself. They planted seeds of doubt in rooms you never entered, with people you trusted, in conversations you would never be invited to review or respond to. That is not chaos. That is architecture. That is a blueprint. That is the kind of calculated, methodical, slow-burning sabotage that only people who are genuinely afraid of you are capable of producing. Because only someone who recognizes your power builds walls, this elaborate to contain it. They were certain. Let that word land properly. CERTAIN. They were not guessing. They were not hoping. They had convinced themselves, somewhere between the third and fourth revision of their strategy, that they had accounted for every variable. They had plugged every gap. They had silenced every witness. They had rewritten every version of the story in which you came out with your dignity intact, and they had replaced those versions with a single, unified, airtight narrative, one in which you were the problem, the liability, the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who had to go. And for a while, it seemed to be working. For a while, the architecture held. But here is the fundamental error every brilliant strategist makes when they are building their plans on a foundation of fear rather than truth. Fear makes you thorough. Fear makes you careful. Fear makes you meticulous about covering every angle. But fear also makes you blind to the one thing you're most afraid of. And what they were most afraid of was you speaking, specifically, clearly, without apology or hesitation or the emotional tremor they had been counting on. They thought they had taken everything from you. They forgot that the one thing they could never confiscate was the version of events that actually happened. Let's talk about your silence, because they misread it so catastrophically. They watched you go quiet, and they translated that silence as surrender. They saw you stop arguing, and they called it defeat. They watched you withdraw from the spaces where their whisper campaigns were loudest, and they celebrated your absence like a military victory, like a flag planted in conquered territory, like proof that their strategy had worked exactly as intended. They popped the metaphorical champagne over your silence. They promoted it. They pointed to it as evidence of your guilt. What they didn't understand is that there are two kinds of silence in this world. There is the silence of someone who has nothing left to say because they have been broken beyond the ability to form language. That silence smells like defeat. It has a particular quality of hollowness to it, a flatness, an absence not just of words but of presence. And then there is the other kind, the silence of someone who is watching, collecting, organizing. The silence of someone who has realized that every word they speak in a battlefield their enemy has chosen is a bullet spent on someone else's terms. That silence is not hollow. It is dense. It is pressurized. It vibrates. Your silence vibrated. You were not absent during those months. You were present in a way that didn't require performance. You were in the corner of every room they thought they had cleared, not physically, not visibly, but in the specific way that truth occupies space even when no one is speaking it aloud. You were accumulating clarity the way a storm accumulates pressure, not dramatically, not with advance warning, not with any of the theatrical signals they were watching for. You were becoming something they had not prepared a response for. You were becoming undeniable. And here's the thing about people who construct elaborate strategies to silence someone. They require that person's silence to continue indefinitely. The whole system depends on it. Every lie that was told, every alliance that was built on distorted versions of your story, every person who was handed a curated image of you that had been deliberately stripped of context, all of it requires your silence as its operating condition. The moment you speak, with clarity and specificity and the unshakable calm of someone who has had a very long time to think, the whole system experiences its first crack, and cracks do not stop at one. Now let's get into the sentence itself. Not the specific words, because your sentence belongs to you, and every person watching this has their own version of it, waiting somewhere in the architecture of their chest like a locked room they haven't opened yet. What matters is the nature of the sentence. What made it so precise, so devastatingly surgical, so irreversible. The sentence that breaks a perfect strategy is never loud. It is never delivered with tears, or rage, or the shaking voice of someone who has been wounded for a long time and is finally erupting. No, the sentence that cracks an empire is delivered the way a surgeon makes an incision, quietly, deliberately, without drama, with absolute knowledge of exactly where the cut needs to go. They had prepared for your anger. They had been hoping for it, frankly, because anger is manageable. Anger looks unstable. Anger gives them the image they'd been constructing of you, reactive, emotional, impossible to work with, a person who loses control under pressure. They had entire responses preloaded for your anger. If you erupted, they were ready to nod slowly and say, "See, this is exactly the behavior we were concerned about." They had made peace with the version of this moment where you raised your voice, where you accused them publicly, where you fell into the emotional register they had assigned you in their narrative. They were not ready for the version where you simply told the truth, calmly, with evidence, with names, with dates. Because here is what happens to a carefully constructed lie when it meets a precise truth delivered without emotion. The lie does not put up a fight. It does not defend itself. It does not argue or negotiate or attempt to reframe. It just becomes visible. Suddenly, every person in the room who had been operating on the version of reality that your silence had allowed to exist without challenge now has to make a very uncomfortable choice. They have to decide whether they saw what they just saw. They have to decide whether they heard what they just heard. They have to decide whether to continue maintaining a story that has just, in front of their eyes, been revealed as engineered. And that moment, that precise moment of decision, That is where empires crack. You didn't just speak. You changed the physics of the room. You altered what was possible to pretend. You did the one thing that a perfect strategy built on someone else's silence absolutely cannot survive. You removed the silence. And without your silence as its foundation, the whole structure had nothing to stand on. The lies needed your quiet. The alliances needed your absence from the story. The narrative they had constructed needed you to remain a character described by others rather than a person capable of describing yourself. One sentence from you, and every single one of those requirements became impossible to fulfill simultaneously. Here is what nobody tells you about the moment an empire built on someone's silence finally hears that person's voice. It doesn't collapse all at once. It doesn't fall in a single dramatic implosion that everyone witnesses simultaneously. It cracks, quietly, then all at once. First, one person who had been holding the weight of the lie starts putting it down. Not publicly, not with any announcement. Just internally, they begin the process of recalibrating. They start replaying conversations they had been given. They start noticing the gaps in the version of you that they were handed. They start asking themselves, very privately, very carefully, what else might have been shaped before they received it. Then another person does the same, and then another, and none of them are talking to each other about it yet, because the machinery of the strategy is still technically running, still producing its outputs, still manufacturing the appearance of a unified front. But internally, in the private spaces where people think their actual thoughts rather than the thoughts they are supposed to have, the doubt is spreading, like water finding its way through concrete, like a frequency traveling through walls, invisible until suddenly it isn't, until suddenly the unified front has hairline fractures that everyone can see, but no one is allowed to acknowledge yet. Until suddenly the performances start getting slightly less convincing. Watch for the signs, because they are always there after the sentence has been spoken. Watch for the person who used to look straight through you and now cannot quite hold eye contact. Watch for the sudden softening in someone who was previously mechanical in their coldness toward you, as if they are recalibrating the energy they are allowed to give you now that the story has a complication. Watch for the ones who were loudest in the campaign against you going unusually quiet. Not because they've admitted anything, but because speaking requires confidence in the version of events you're speaking from, and the version they'd been using has just developed a structural problem. And the ones at the center, the architects, the strategists, the ones who designed the original plan and held the blueprint, watch what happens to their certainty. The certainty that was their defining characteristic. The certainty that made them walk into rooms with that particular quality of unhurried confidence. The certainty that made their lies sound like obvious truths because they delivered them with such absolute conviction that certainty is now performing. It's no longer natural. It's now a mask they're holding over a face that has gone uncertain. And holding a mask requires both hands, which means they're no longer free to build with them. Now we need to discuss something that they genuinely, fundamentally, catastrophically miscalculated. They understood risk management. They had a cost-benefit structure for their strategy. They had factored in the possibility of exposure, of partial discovery, of minor complications in the narrative. What they had not factored in, what they were constitutionally incapable of factoring in, was the cost of being on the wrong side of someone who has nothing left to protect. Because there is a very specific kind of dangerous that a person becomes when they have been stripped of the things they use to be careful about protecting. There is a freedom in having had everything taken that makes the truth cost exactly nothing to speak. Let me explain what I mean by that. Before the strategy deployed against you, you had things to lose. Relationships you wanted to preserve, perceptions you were invested in maintaining. A version of peace that required you to keep certain truths quiet, not because the truths were shameful, but because speaking them would have required a level of confrontation you were not ready for, a burning of bridges you were still hoping to repair, a closing of doors you were still trying to keep open. Your silence in that earlier period was not weakness. It was investment. You were protecting something. But they kept taking and taking and taking. They took the relationships. They took the perceptions. They took the peace. They took the open doors and they slammed them one by one with their palms flat against the frames so you could hear each closure. And at a certain point, a very specific tipping point that feels different for every person but is always recognizable in retrospect, you stopped having things that could be taken. And the moment you stopped having things that could be taken, you stopped having reasons to be careful. You became, in the truest possible sense, free. Free in the way that only someone who has been comprehensively stripped of everything they were once protecting ever becomes. Because they were still playing the game where you had things to lose. Their entire strategy in its final phase was built around leveraging those things against you, apply enough pressure to the right relationships, the right perceptions, the right opportunities, and you will maintain your silence indefinitely, rather than risk losing what's left. What they missed is that by the time they deployed that final phase, there was nothing left to leverage. They had already taken it. They arrived at the negotiating table to find that you had no remaining stake in the negotiation, and a person with no stake in the negotiation has only one thing to offer: the truth. Here is where the story shifts completely. Here is the moment the entire dynamic of the last however many months inverts like a negative film exposure, where everything that was dark becomes light, and everything that was light gets revealed as shadow. For the entire duration of their campaign, the scrutiny was moving in one direction. They were watching you. They were analyzing you. They were building case files in their heads, collecting evidence of your supposed flaws, documenting every instance where you appeared vulnerable or uncertain or reactive, treating you like a subject under observation rather than a person with the capacity for observation. They had the microscope, they had the lab coat, they had the clipboard. You were the specimen. But here is the thing about scrutiny that the scrutinizers always forget. While they were watching you, you were watching them. While they were analyzing your behavior, you were, with every observation they made and every move they orchestrated, learning theirs. You were learning who they called first when they needed something covered. You were learning which alliances were transactional and which ones were built on mutual fear rather than genuine loyalty. You were learning the gaps between their public positioning and their private desperation. You were learning, very specifically and very thoroughly, exactly how their system worked. And now that the microscope has turned, what does it reveal about them? It reveals that the confidence was performance. It reveals that the alliances were held together by shared investment in a particular version of events, rather than by any genuine affection or respect. It reveals that the certainty, that weaponized certainty that they wore like armor through the entire campaign, was, at its core, a kind of magical thinking. A collective agreement to believe something not because it was true, but because the alternative, acknowledging the truth, was too expensive for everyone involved. What the turning microscope reveals is not complexity or depth or sophistication. What it reveals is the oldest, simplest story in the world. People who felt small, making someone else smaller, and calling it strategy. You are not angry at this revelation. That is the most important thing. Because anger would suggest that you expected better from them, that you are still operating on some level of surprise. But you are not surprised. You processed the surprise a long time ago, in the quiet, in the withdrawal, in the months of watching without speaking. What you feel now, standing in the new physics of this room where the microscope has turned and the sentence has been spoken and the empire has its first irreparable crack, is something closer to clarity. Clean, cold, absolute clarity. Which, as it happens, is exactly the most dangerous thing you could possibly feel. We need to speak directly, briefly, specifically to the people who were recruited into the strategy against you, the ones who weren't architects, the ones who didn't design the blueprint but agreed to carry the bricks. The colleagues, the mutual friends, the acquaintances who were handed a version of you that had been carefully pre-processed, stripped of its context, deprived of your perspective, polished, until it looked like objective observation rather than the manufactured narrative it actually was. The ones who made the decision, consciously or through comfortable passive acceptance, to receive that version of you as true without asking for your input. Here is the complicated grace of this moment for those people. They did not have access to the sentence you just spoke before you spoke it. They were operating on the information they had been given, in the specific social context where questioning that information would have cost them something: access, belonging, the warmth of the in-group that had recruited them. That is not an excuse. Adults are responsible for what they choose to accept as true without verification, but it is a context. It means that what is now required from them is not punishment, but decision. Some of them will make the right decision quietly. They will recalibrate without public announcement, without dramatic declaration, simply allowing a gradual restoration of something closer to fairness in how they treat you and speak of you. They will not apologize, not because they lack the capacity for it, but because apology requires admitting that a choice was made, and that admission carries its own costs that some people are not ready to pay. Accept this quiet recalibration for what it is. Accept the changed behavior without requiring the explicit acknowledgement, because requiring the acknowledgement closes the door to the changed behavior, and the changed behavior is ultimately what matters. And some of them will not recalibrate. Some of them will double down. Some of them, because their identity is now so deeply entangled with the version of events that your sentence disrupted, will find it genuinely impossible to absorb the new information without experiencing it as a threat to themselves. These people will require the architecture to remain standing even as it cracks around them. They will maintain the performance of certainty with increasing effort and decreasing conviction. And you will recognize them not by their loudness, but by the very specific quality of desperation that exists in a person who is working hard to believe something they have already, privately, begun to doubt. Now listen closely, because this section is the one that separates the people who survive this kind of thing from the ones who let it eventually consume them from the other direction. There are several things you are not going to do in the aftermath of the sentence. You are not going to celebrate loudly, not because you don't have the right to, but because loud celebration in this context is not victory, it is recruitment material for the people who need to reframe your justified sense of vindication as instability or arrogance or proof that you were the aggressor all along. Your victory is not a performance. Your victory is a result. You are not going to explain yourself to everyone who is now suddenly available and curious, because the curiosity is not always interest in your truth. Some of it is information gathering. Some of it is people figuring out which side is safer to be on now that the balance has shifted. The sentence has already done its work. The sentence does not require a follow-up lecture. The sentence does not need to be expanded into a comprehensive case. The sentence stands alone, clean and precise, and anything you add to it dilutes its clarity. You are not going to go looking for the acknowledgement from the architects. This is crucial. This is the trap that swallows more people than any other at this stage. The moment you decide that what you need, what would complete this, is for the person who designed the strategy against you to admit that what they did was wrong, you have handed them a new lever. Because they will withhold that acknowledgement for as long as they are physically capable of doing so, and you do not need it. Your clarity is not contingent on their confession. Your sentence was not a question waiting for their answer. And finally, you are not going to become what was done to you. You are not going to build a strategy. You are not going to curate a narrative. You are not going to whisper in hallways or recruit allies by delivering pre-processed versions of events, because the sentence worked not because it was strategic, it worked because it was true. Truth is not a strategy. It It is a different category of thing entirely. It does not require architecture. It does not require maintenance. It does not crack under pressure. It simply exists. And it keeps existing. And it keeps working without your help. Ah, look who finally connected the dots. You magnificent, paranoid, absolutely correct human being. Welcome to the revelation you've been avoiding, because the truth was too ugly, too twisted, too perfectly designed to make you feel crazy. But you're not crazy. You're awake. And what you're seeing isn't gossip anymore. It's confession. It's projection. It's them screaming their own secrets while pointing at you. And oh, the irony is so thick you could choke on it. Let's start with something simple. Something so obvious you'll wonder why it took this long to see. Every single thing they accused you of, every whisper, every sideways comment, every "I'm just concerned about them" conversation they had behind your back. It wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was their autobiography written in invisible ink. And you beautiful, trusting fool, you thought they were describing you. They called you manipulative while pulling strings you didn't even know existed. They called you fake while wearing masks so thick their real face forgot how to breathe. They called you selfish while draining every resource, every emotion, every ounce of energy you had left. And you believed them, didn't you? Even if just for a second. Even if just in that 3 a.m. spiral where doubt creeps in like smoke under a locked door. But here's the thing about projection. It's not just a defense mechanism, it's a confession under oath. When someone obsessively talks about what you're allegedly doing wrong, they're not analyzing you, they're narrating their own behavior. The cheater who constantly accuses you of cheating, the liar who questions every word you say, the manipulator who warns everyone that you're the puppet master. It's not insight, it's a mirror, and they're too blind to see their own reflection staring back. They're literally telling on themselves while thinking they're exposing you, and the tragic comedy of it all is they can't stop. They're compelled. They're addicted to projecting because facing their own truth would shatter the fragile reality they've built. Let's talk about why they needed you to be the villain so desperately, so urgently, so completely. Because if you're the problem, then they're innocent. If you're the manipulator, then their schemes are justified. If you're the toxic one, then their poison becomes medicine in their twisted narrative. They needed you guilty because your innocence made them visible, made their darkness impossible to ignore, made the contrast so sharp that anyone paying attention could see exactly who was who. So they launched a campaign, a quiet war, fought with whispers and implications, with concerned tones and strategic silences, with carefully placed doubts designed to spread like infection through every mutual connection you shared. And for a while, maybe it worked. Maybe people believed them. Maybe you lost friends, opportunities, peace of mind. Maybe you spent months, years even, trying to prove your innocence to people who were never going to believe you because belief wasn't the point. Control was. They didn't want truth. They wanted a narrative they could live with. A story where they weren't the villain, where their actions made sense, where their cruelty had justification. But here's what they didn't account for. The truth doesn't need your belief to exist, and eventually, the mask slips. The projection becomes too obvious. The patterns become too clear, and people start noticing not what you're doing, but what they're saying about you, and how strangely specific it all sounds. You ever notice how their accusations had details, vivid details, scenarios so specific you wondered where they even came from? That's because they came from their life, their choices, their guilty conscience narrating itself through your name. When they said you couldn't be trusted, it's because they were already betraying someone. When they said you were using people, it's because they saw relationships as transactions and assumed everyone else did too. When they said you were playing victim, it's because they were terrified of their own accountability, terrified that if they stopped playing offense, they'd have to play defense. And their defense was non-existent. Every accusation was a confession. Every criticism was a self-portrait. Every warning about you was an autobiography they were too cowardly to own. And the beautiful thing, the absolutely poetic thing about projection, is that it has an expiration date. You can only blame someone else for your own behavior for so long before the pattern becomes visible, before the story stops making sense, before people start asking why this person is so obsessed with someone they claim to want nothing to do with. Why are they still talking about you months after you stop talking about them? Why do they bring you up in conversations that have nothing to do with you? Why does your name live rent-free in their mouth when you've evicted them from your mind? It's because you're not the subject of their gossip. You're the character in their confession, and they can't stop confessing because the guilt is eating them alive from the inside out. Let's get specific. Let's talk about the types of projections you probably encountered, the flavors of confession disguised as concern. First, there's the loyalty projection, where someone who's been disloyal to everyone they've ever known accuses you of being untrustworthy. They've backstabbed their way through life, switched sides whenever convenient, sold out people for personal gain, and yet somehow, you're the one who can't be trusted. It's almost funny if it wasn't so calculated. They need everyone to doubt your loyalty, because if people trust you, they might tell you things, and those things might reveal the truth about who's really been playing both sides all along. So they plant seeds, drop hints, create doubt where none existed, all while their own loyalty is as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. Then there's the emotional manipulation projection, the one where someone who's been pulling strings, manufacturing drama, and orchestrating chaos behind the scenes has the audacity to call you manipulative. They've gaslit people into questioning their own reality, twisted situations to fit their narrative, played victim and villain depending on what served them best. And yet you who barely have the energy to manage your own emotions, let alone anyone else's, you're the master manipulator in their story. It's projection so blatant, it's almost art. They see manipulation everywhere because they can't imagine a world where people act without ulterior motives, where kindness isn't a strategy, where honesty isn't a weapon, because in their world, it never is. So they assume you operate the same way. And when you don't, when you're genuinely just trying to exist without playing games, it confuses them so deeply they have to reframe it as a game they just haven't figured out yet. And then, there's the victim mentality projection, the crown jewel of psychological confession. This is where someone who's caused damage, hurt people, burned bridges, and left destruction in their wake accuses you of playing victim. The irony is so thick, it's suffocating. They've weaponized their own pain, used their trauma as a shield for their toxicity, demanded understanding while offering none, and collected sympathy like currency. Yet you who suffered in silence, who healed without broadcasting, who took accountability even when you didn't need to, you're the one playing victim. It's because watching you acknowledge pain without weaponizing it terrifies them, because it reveals that healing is a choice, and they've chosen not to make it. They've chosen to stay wounded, to stay bitter, to use their hurt as justification for hurting others. And your quiet strength is a mirror they can't stand to look into. But here's where it gets even darker, even more twisted. The gossip, the accusations, the character assassination. It's not just projection, it's preparation. They're building a narrative in advance, creating a story that will explain away whatever they're about to do or have already done. If they can convince people you're untrustworthy before you find out they betrayed you, then when you react, you're just being paranoid, just being dramatic, just proving their point. If they can paint you as manipulative before people discover they manipulated the situation, then any evidence you present looks like more manipulation. It's preemptive damage control, a narrative insurance policy. And you were so busy defending yourself from false accusations that you didn't realize they were setting up an alibi for crimes they hadn't even committed yet in your eyes, but had already committed in reality. Think about it. How many times did their accusations come right before you discovered something? Right before a truth came out? Right before the mask slipped? It's not coincidence, it's strategy. They needed people to doubt you before you had reason to doubt them. They needed your credibility destroyed before their actions came to light. They needed the narrative set so firmly that when you finally spoke your truth, it sounded like exactly what they'd been warning everyone about. It's psychological warfare, and the weapon is your own reputation turned against you, sharpened with lies, wielded with gossip, and aimed at your throat before you even knew you were in a fight. And the confession, the real confession, is in the timing, in the desperation, in the urgency with which they needed everyone to see you as the problem. Now, let's talk about what happens when the projection starts to crack, when people start noticing the patterns, when the gossip stops landing the way it used to. Because projection has a fatal flaw. It requires other people to believe it, and belief requires consistency. But projectors aren't consistent because they're not telling a true story. They're telling a useful story, and usefulness changes. So the narrative shifts. First you were manipulative, then you were crazy, then you were jealous, then you were obsessed. And wait, hold on, which one is it? The story keeps changing because it was never about what you did. It was about what they needed people to believe. And different situations required different villains. But eventually, people notice. They notice the story doesn't add up. They notice the intensity doesn't match the crime. They notice that for someone who claims to want distance, this person sure can't stop talking about you. And that's when the projection becomes a noose. Because once people see it, they can't unsee it. Once the pattern is clear, every past accusation gets re-examined. Every whispered warning gets questioned. Every dramatic retelling gets analyzed, not for what it says about you, but for what it reveals about them. And suddenly, all that gossip becomes a confession tape playing on repeat for anyone willing to listen closely. The cheating accusations reveal their infidelity. The lying accusations reveal their dishonesty. The manipulation accusations reveal their control tactics. It's all there, every crime they committed listed clearly in the accusations they made against you. And the evidence isn't in what you did, it's in what they couldn't stop talking about. Because guilty people can't help but confess, they just do it by pointing at someone else. Here's the part that probably kept you up at night, the part that made you question everything, the part that had you wondering if maybe, just maybe, they were right about you. You started seeing their accusations in your own behavior. Not because you were actually doing what they said, but because when someone insists you're something long enough, loudly enough, confidently enough, your brain starts scanning for evidence to prove them right. It's called the spotlight effect, mixed with accusation trauma. They said you were selfish, so every time you prioritized yourself, even in healthy, necessary ways, you felt guilty. They said you were manipulative, so every time you set a boundary or made a request, you questioned your motives. They said you were fake, so you started monitoring your own authenticity until you felt like a stranger to yourself. That's not evidence of their accuracy, that's evidence of their impact. And it's exactly what they wanted, you doubting yourself so thoroughly that you'd never doubt them. But let's flip the script, literally. Let's talk about what you actually did that made their projection so necessary, so urgent, so vicious. You existed authentically in a space where they needed people to perform. You healed in an environment where they needed everyone to stay broken so their dysfunction felt normal. You set boundaries in relationships where they needed unlimited access. You grew in circles where they needed everyone to stay small so they could feel big. You saw through their masks in a dynamic where everyone was supposed to play along. You were the variable they couldn't control, the mirror they couldn't crack, the truth they couldn't spin. And that was your real crime. Not manipulation or dishonesty or toxicity, but clarity, authenticity, growth, and the refusal to shrink yourself to fit their narrative. And here's the confession hidden in their gossip, the one they'll never say out loud but you need to hear. They saw something in you they killed in themselves. Maybe it was integrity. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was the ability to be alone rather than compromise values. Maybe it was self-respect. Maybe it was healing capacity. Whatever it was, they recognized it, mourned it, resented it, and decided if they couldn't have it, they'd destroy it in you, or at least convince everyone else it wasn't real. The gossip was grief. The accusations were envy. The character assassination was their suicide note for the person they could have been, should have been, chose not to be, and watching you be that person anyway was unbearable. So they tried to kill it by proxy, tried to murder your light with their words, tried to bury your truth under their lies, and called it concern, called it protection, called it anything but what it was, which was a confession of their own spiritual bankruptcy. Let's go deeper, because we're not here for surface observations. We're here for excavation. The specific things they accused you of, write them down if you haven't already. Look at the list, really look at it. Now ask yourself, who in this situation actually demonstrated these behaviors? Not in your anxious imagination, not in your trauma-soaked analysis of your own actions, but in objective reality. Who actually manipulated situations? Who actually lied consistently? Who actually used people? Who actually played victim while victimizing others? Who actually betrayed trust? Whose actions, not whose accusations, match the crimes listed? I'd bet everything the answer isn't you, the answer is them, and the proof isn't in their words about you, it's in their actions toward you and everyone else unlucky enough to enter their orbit. Here's a pattern you probably noticed. They accused you of things that would be almost impossible for you to definitively disprove. How do you prove you're not manipulative when any defense sounds like manipulation to people primed to see it? How do you prove you're not playing victim when talking about actual harm sounds like victimhood to people invested in the abuser's narrative? How do you prove you're trustworthy to people who've been told you're a liar, when anything you say gets filtered through that lens? You can't, and that's the point. They chose accusations that were unfalsifiable, untestable, based entirely on interpretation and perception, because those accusations don't need evidence, they just need repetition. Say something enough times with enough conviction, and it becomes truth in the minds of people who don't investigate, who don't question, who just absorb and repeat. And the confession in that strategy is simple. They knew they had no real evidence, no concrete examples, no actual proof, so they trafficked in vibes and implications in the power of suggestion, because facts were never on their side. And what about the intensity, the obsessive quality of their gossip? Normal people don't spend years talking about someone they claim to dislike. Normal people move on. Normal people forget. Normal people live their own lives without needing to narrate someone else's. But these people, they couldn't stop, couldn't let go, couldn't move forward without dragging your name backward. Why? Because you weren't just a person to them, you were a symbol. You represented something they needed to defeat, an idea they needed to kill, a possibility they needed to eliminate. Maybe you represented the life they could have had if they'd made different choices. Maybe you represented the person they pretended to be before the mask became permanent. Maybe you represented freedom they traded for control, or peace they sacrificed for power, or authenticity they buried under performance. Whatever you represented, it haunted them, and the only way they knew how to exorcise that ghost was to destroy the symbol, to assassinate the character, to eliminate the evidence that another way of being was possible. But here's the thing about symbols. You can't kill them with gossip. You can only make them stronger. Every accusation that didn't stick became armor. Every lie that got exposed became a lesson. Every person who saw through their narrative became an ally. Every moment you didn't break became proof of something they couldn't comprehend, which is genuine strength. Not the performative kind, not the loud kind, not the aggressive kind, but the kind that endures, that outlasts, that survives, specifically because it doesn't need validation, doesn't need vindication, doesn't need anything from the people throwing stones. And that strength, that quiet, unshakable presence in the face of their storm. That was the final confession you forced from them without saying a word. The confession that they were never strong enough to break you, never credible enough to convince everyone, never powerful enough to write the ending they wanted. Now let's address the people who believed them, who repeated the gossip, who participated in your character assassination, either actively or passively. Here's what you need to understand. They're not all evil. Some are just lazy. Some are just cowards. Some are just so desperate to be on the winning side they'll believe anything the loudest voice says. Some genuinely thought they were helping by warning others about you. Some were manipulated just as much as you were, just in different ways. And some knew exactly what they were doing and chose cruelty anyway. But here's the part that matters for your peace. Their participation in the lie doesn't make the lie true. And eventually, when the projection becomes undeniable, when the patterns become clear, when the truth comes out the way truth always does, those people will have a choice. Admit they were wrong or double down on the lie. And that choice? That will reveal who they actually are, not who they claimed to be when it was convenient. The confession in the gossip is complete when you realize they told everyone exactly who they were. They just used your name. They confessed to manipulation by accusing you of it. They confessed to dishonesty by questioning yours. They confessed to toxicity by labeling you toxic. They confessed to selfishness by calling you selfish. They confessed to playing victim by accusing you of it. They wrote their entire autobiography in the margins of your life story. And if you read it right, if you see it clearly, you'll realize the gossip was never about you. It was always, always about them. And the tragedy, the absolute tragedy, is they'll never admit it. They'll never take accountability. They'll never apologize. They'll never acknowledge that every word they spoke against you was a mirror they were too terrified to look into. So what do you do with this realization, with this clarity, with this confirmation that you're not crazy, you were just surrounded by people confessing their crimes while prosecuting you for existing? You do nothing. Absolutely nothing. You don't confront. You don't explain. You don't defend. You don't try to make them see what they're determined to stay blind to. You simply exist in your truth, live your life, heal your wounds, and let their confession stand on its own. Because the beautiful thing about projection is it's self-exposing. Give it time. Give it space. Give it room to breathe and repeat and contradict itself. And eventually, anyone paying attention will see exactly what you see, which is people so desperate to avoid their own reflection, they created a whole fictional character and called it you. Strength, that quiet, unshakable presence in the face of their storm. That was the final confession you forced from them without saying a word. The confession that they were never strong enough to break you, never credible enough to convince everyone, never powerful enough to write the ending they wanted. Now let's address the people who believed them, who repeated the gossip, who participated in your character assassination, either actively or passively. Here's what you need to understand. They're not all evil. Some are just lazy. Some are just cowards. Some are just so desperate to be on the winning side they'll believe anything the loudest voice says. Some genuinely thought they were helping by warning others about you. Some were manipulated just as much as you were, just in different ways. And some knew exactly what they were doing and chose cruelty anyway. But here's the part that matters for your peace. Their participation in the lie doesn't make the lie true. And eventually, when the projection becomes undeniable, when the patterns become clear, when the truth comes out the way truth always does, those people will have a choice. Admit they were wrong or double down on the lie. And that choice? That will reveal who they actually are, not who they claimed to be when it was convenient. The confession in the gossip is complete when you realize they told everyone exactly who they were. They just used your name. They confessed to manipulation by accusing you of it. They confessed to dishonesty by questioning yours. They confessed to toxicity by labeling you toxic. They confess to selfishness by calling you selfish. They confess to playing victim by accusing you of it. They wrote their entire autobiography in the margins of your life story. And if you read it right, if you see it clearly, you'll realize the gossip was never about you. It was always, always about them. And the tragedy, the absolute tragedy, is they'll never admit it. They'll never take accountability. They'll never apologize. They'll never acknowledge that every word they spoke against you was a mirror they were too terrified to look into. So what do you do with this realization, with this clarity, with this confirmation that you're not crazy, you were just surrounded by people confessing their crimes while prosecuting you for existing? You do nothing. Absolutely nothing. You don't confront. You don't explain. You don't defend. You don't try to make them see what they're determined to stay blind to. You simply exist in your truth, live your life, heal your wounds, and let their confession stand on its own. Because the beautiful thing about projection is it's self-exposing. Give it time. Give it space. Give it room to breathe and repeat and contradict itself. And eventually, anyone paying attention will see exactly what you see, which is people so desperate to avoid their own reflection, they created a whole fictional character and called it you.